Right. Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the Ashe Lecture, presented by the Center. Is this on? Okay. Presented by the Center for National Security and Foreign Affairs here at the Baker School of Public Policy and Public Affairs. That's a very long name. So we're delighted that you are here. It's great to see you. My name is Krista Wiegand. I'm the director of the Center for National Security and Foreign Affairs. And before we begin, I just want to tell you briefly about the center and what we're doing, and a little bit about this event and the events we've had this week. We are a center that advances policy-relevant research. We work with students. We have concentrations and certificates in national security and nuclear security and nuclear strategy. And we do public engagement like these events. We have a lot of talks. There's a flyer out there if you're interested in our many events this semester. This week alone demonstrates the mission in action that we're doing. Yesterday, we partnered with the East-West Center, which is based in Honolulu, but also in Washington, D.C., as well as the Embassy of Japan. We hosted a panel talking specifically about the relationship between Tennessee, the state of Tennessee, and Japan. And so that was a wonderful event. On Friday, we're hosting a talk and also a student career event for professional development for our students by Scott Roker, who's a vice president at Nuclear Threat Initiative. So he'll be talking about emerging nuclear security issues. And then we have lots of other events later on. But tonight, I would like to welcome, I'm going to introduce Victor Ashe, our host, and then he will introduce our guest speaker. So we are here, of course, tonight in some part because of Victor Ashe, who is ambassador to Poland. He has decades of public service in Knoxville and to our country, and even to the Baker School here as well at the University of Tennessee. So he's shaped this community in lasting ways. He's Knoxville's longest-serving mayor. He helped transform the city through waterfront development, the construction of the convention center, preservation of historic landmarks, and the expansion of public parks. As ambassador to Poland, he strengthened international partnerships and was recognized with the Commander's Cross with the Star of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. From the earliest days of the Baker Center, before we became a school many years ago, Ambassador Ashe has been a steadfast partner. He established the Ashe Lecture Series, which brings distinguished public servants to campus twice a year to share insights drawn from experiences on leadership and diplomacy. Tonight's conversation is especially timely as we welcome former Ambassador Kate Byrnes, our guest speaker. She's a distinguished diplomat, and she's also the center's newest distinguished fellow. So we're thrilled to have her here, and it's my privilege to introduce Ambassador Ashe.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. I want to recognize Marianne Wanamaker, who is the dean of the Baker School and is doing a fabulous job. And the former director, Carl Pierce, is here as well. Also, privileged to sit beside Chancellor Emeritus Jimmy Cheek, who's here. And I also want to recognize one of our newest members of the Knoxville City Council, Nathan Honeycutt, father of Hudson. And Mayor Carl Cola of the town of Rockford, Tennessee, who has served longer than any mayor, I think, around, 24 years now? Yes, all right. And Ed Schaus, former trustee, and George Wallace, former member of the Knoxville City Council as well. We're really privileged to have not only the former ambassador to North Macedonia here with us, but she was also Deputy Chief of Mission or Charge of the embassy and our embassy in Athens, Greece. She was active with the OSCE in Vienna and also with the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And she has had 32 years in the State Department, recently retired, and chose East Tennessee as the area in which she wanted to spend the next many years. With that, it's a great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Byrnes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. We start with that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ashe, for the warm welcome that you have given me, not just tonight, but to the community. And thank you for your incredible service. Ambassador Ashe was actually ambassador to Poland when I was serving at the U.S. mission to NATO, and I can tell you that part of the reason Poland is such a strong ally today is because of the work that he did, along with Mrs. Ashe, to develop and cultivate that relationship and to continue to cultivate and develop that relationship even after his service as ambassador. So thank you for that. I want to thank Dean Wanamaker and Dr. Wiegand for introducing me to the Baker School and to the incredible mission that you are trying to do. Your efforts to bring Senator Baker's compelling legacy and to connect it to geopolitics and what's happening today is exciting. It's contagious. And it's what's made me want to be a part of the work that you're doing and to join this incredible team in this incredible community. And I want to thank everybody who was here. You are all very, very busy people. And I am humble enough to recognize that everybody has an opinion and you're not here to hear my opinion, right? You're here because you care about what's happening in the world, because you watch and listen to events taking place and you want to know some of the context behind it. And let's face it, the last couple of months, the headlines have given us a lot to digest. When we look at the topic that I've been asked to address, the end of an era, rupture, wrecking ball politics, a new global disorder. I mean, these are sensational, fantastic headlines. And for those of us who care about world events, of somewhat concern, right? But of course, the media's job is to inform. And to inform, they have to grab attention. And what's lost in all of this is the context. And we cannot afford to have quips drive our policy or our public opinion. So it's important that we have opportunities like this, like the Ashe lecture that you have given us, to be able to sit down and talk about that. And what I'm going to try to do today is share with you some context about the events that I've been asked to address. It comes with bias, of course. I hope that's the bias of my experience as a practitioner of diplomacy, but also as a person. And so let me just, as a disclaimer, offer some of that up front. And thank you for the kind, generous introduction. But I will go back even further. My parents, great-grandparents, immigrated from Europe, from Ireland in the 19th century, and then from the Slovak part of the Kingdom of Hungary in the beginning of the 20th century. I was born in Italy to a diplomat who was serving there at the time. My father was a Foreign Service officer himself. I was an undergraduate student at Georgetown University when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, when Eastern European countries were choosing democracy and looking for help and assistance to get there, when socialist Yugoslavia dissolved and new countries in the Western Balkans were trying to find their footing and their start. I didn't join the Foreign Service necessarily to focus on Europe. In fact, I tried very hard in my first assignment to go anywhere but Europe so that I could expand my experiences and my knowledge. But I was sent to Turkey. And from then on, more or less off and on, I have been working on U.S., European, NATO issues in one form or another. I did that as a public relations officer. I did it on a fellowship at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I was responsible for organizing NATO enlargement hearings and asking some tough questions at the U.S. mission to NATO, at the OSCE, from 2014 to 2017, a critical time as they grappled with the situation in Ukraine. And then obviously more recently in some of the positions and at the U.S. European Command, where even after the great opportunity of serving as a U.S. ambassador, the honor of my life, I then had a chance to go work at a command and serve as an advisor to a man who not only commanded all of U.S. forces in Europe, but also served dual-hatted as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces. And I say all of that because I put on the surface, I am a transatlanticist. I am a transatlanticist from birth, through my genes, through my practice, and I believe in the value of that relationship. And I did what we all now do, and I Googled transatlanticist from Google AI just to remember what it stands for. And a transatlanticist is an individual who supports, promotes, or believes in maintaining strong political and economic ties between Western Europe and North America, specifically the United States and Canada. So that's me. I think these relationships matter. I think it's really, really important. And I am still a transatlanticist today. Unlike in previous years, this year, I watched last weekend's Munich Security Conference online, probably like some of you. And maybe because I was watching it and alternating back and forth between the Olympics and Milan Cortina, maybe because I still remain very hopeful and positive and optimistic about what we can do in our relationships with Europe, I found a lot to be positive about, and I saw some real concrete developments. At the same time, I acknowledge that parts of the tone and tenor of those conversations left me with some concern, and I think some of you may also have the same, based again on some of those headlines that we've all seen and we've all talked about. Okay, so that's my introduction. The topic that Krista asked me to talk about today, and again, because of the headlines, was Greenland and U.S.-European affairs. So I'm going to try to offer some kind of broad parameters to that. I'm not a good university professor. I'm not good on time. I'll do my best to do what we talked about. But let me offer just some general points. I'll put them up front so there's no spoiler alert. I'll delve a little bit into the context and then, maybe focus on some of the bigger, broader questions that I think about today, now that I'm retired. And I would say I'm still in the process of retiring. I'm a public policy officer at heart. I've served multiple administrations. I would continue to serve multiple administrations if I didn't want to now prioritize my family, my husband, Scott Gage, who was kind enough to be here in the audience today, my brother, Paul Byrnes, who's in the back of the room, his wife, Ginny, and the rest of my family that's here in the United States, and relish the opportunity to get to know my country again. But at any rate, let me offer that context and some thoughts, and then I look forward to your discussion. Okay, so the three main points, I would say. First of all, the tensions in the U.S.-European relationship today are not new. The debate, the concerns over burden sharing, we talk about defense spending, these are long-standing. What we have seen in recent months gives me hope that concrete actions are being taken to address things that have been problems for a long, long period of time that many of us have worked about. That's number one. Number two, Greenland is strategically important. It is important to deter the expansionism of Russia and China. But it is part of a broader Arctic problem set and a broader geopolitical challenge. And we have now, as a result of these discussions, I think a very good way to manage this process and the issue of Greenland through NATO and some of our vital partnerships. So that's my third point. Partnerships. Partnerships are an essential mechanism to secure the peace. We have consistently, the United States, a record of doing whole of government approach better than anybody in the world. And by whole of government approach, I mean combining what the military would call all of the instruments of national security power, the dime, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools together for great effect. That dime and those tools can't just be done in the moment. We must also apply the same framework to our partnerships. They are investments over time so that we are prepared to face not just the challenges today, but the ones that are coming, the ones we see and the ones we don't. So those are my three key points. Now that I have a little bit of time, let me go back and dig into them a little bit. All right, let's start with burden sharing and U.S.-European relationships. Okay, as I said, not a new conversation. In fact, I had the opportunity to attend the Munich Security Conference in 2009 and 2010. And I was there in 2023, 2024, and 2025. And we talked about this issue. We have talked about this issue for a long time. Actually, Eisenhower talked about this issue, right? 5 years after the founding of NATO, he predicted that, hey, the U.S. well will run dry, and the Europeans are going to have to pick up this responsibility. But the reality was, we didn't want to give up our pole position. We didn't want to give up the advantage of holding the strings and the controls over a lot of these relationships. And so while we said that the Europeans needed to step up, we didn't necessarily do things that would provide them the incentive to step up. And a lot was happening in the world over time. I won't talk about the history of the Cold War, the post-Cold War, the peace dividend, the fact that because of the U.S. investments in NATO and NATO country investments over time, we had built out an infrastructure in which the populations in Europe felt relatively secure. So, Europeans, you need to do more for security. Sure, but with what money? With what resources? And why should we redirect from our healthcare system and our education and all of these things if we don't feel the threat? And if there's somebody there who's going to make sure that, at the end of the day, something really bad happens, it's going to be there. This is the reality, right? So we're having these conversations. Europeans, you need to do this. But nothing really changes. We probably started talking really seriously about burden sharing with our European and NATO allies 2007, maybe, but not really. Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference, actually laid out some of the things we're seeing play out today. Everybody listened, thought it was a show, got a little bit worried, and then went back to focusing on the things that they were focusing on. 2008, Putin goes into Georgia, ostensibly to help two territories with their self-identification, but the result was Georgia lost 20% of its territory, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Didn't really see Russia yet as a threat. I mean, obviously it was a threat to Georgia, but don't acknowledge that. But for the Europeans, there wasn't really a sense of movement or action or ownership at this time. Fast forward to 2014 and Russia's annexation of Crimea and its invasion into the territories of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, start of what we would see later. Now finally we have a little bit of action, right? Our administration works very hard, diplomatically and others, to go into the Wales summit. NATO allied countries pledged 2%, right? And then many of them don't even make it, right? So here we are, grappling with this issue. I'm at the OSCE. We're concerned about Ukraine, but are the Europeans really, really investing anything other than their diplomatic leadership in solving this problem? Not really, right? It hasn't really become an existential threat. And that really doesn't happen until February 2022. Now we have Russia's full-scale. And by the way, a year earlier, Putin had published an article, open press, on the historical unity of Ukraine and Russia. Laid this all out. Still, we weren't really prepared. We talked about the possibility. We engaged in diplomatic negotiations, but militarily, defense spending-wise, we weren't prepared. February 2022 happens, and to their credit, our allies across Europe really stood up in support of security assistance to Ukraine. It really did. That defense spending on NATO investments, still not quite there. And you know what? Even in 2024, we had 23 of now 32 allies, because Sweden and Finland had joined as a result of Russia's aggression, but only 23 of 32 were spending that 2%. Right? So what happened? We had an election, and we worked towards another summit. And in the lead up to the Hague summit last summer, and since, the message from the administration was clear. It's not 2%, it's 5%. And Europeans, you're going to have to stand up if you want us to be in NATO. And it was consistent, and it was privately, publicly, same message, very important. And you know what? They're doing it, right? It's had some result. There's no question about that. And, it was acknowledged in Munich. The Europeans are standing up. They're also reforming their institutions. The EU has now actually pledged its own resources for its defense industry. It has committed to changing regulations so that countries can actually increase their defense spending. They were, under economic stringency rules, they couldn't. Now they can do that. There's loan instruments. There's investment opportunities. There's joint procurement through regulation. The Europeans are responding with all of these things. So there's a lot of positive momentum that has come out of this. That's really important. But there are some other things we need to consider. And the first and foremost of that is obviously relationships, and I'll talk more about that, and partnerships and what that does. And then some real things. Like, are we really prepared for the European defense industry to stand up, right? With or without U.S. industry being involved? Are we really prepared for the Europeans to start producing things that have fueled our economy for years? Are we prepared for them to potentially develop technologies that are dependent on critical resources or energy that doesn't come either from themselves or from the United States or a trusted partner? Are those things that we've really thought through, right? Decision making. Are we really prepared to have the Europeans be able to make decisions about when and how to deploy weapons without a voice from the United States? Now, this is not going to happen in the next 6 years, but these are questions that I think we should all be thinking through, and we as diplomats would be preparing our leaders to address and to think about as we move forward. Do we understand what we might be giving up through our platforms, our presence in Europe, if we ask other people to run those missions for us? What would we miss out on, right? Would we be able to conduct operations like we conducted last summer, Operation Midnight Hammer? It wasn't a European operation, but I can tell you that the folks at the U.S. European Command were in every single important meeting as we prepared in a very tight classified circle for that operation. Why? Because for us to send long-range bombers from the United States to Iran to conduct an operation of such significance against their nuclear facilities required platforms and support. And where did we get those platforms and support and the refueling and the operations? From our European partners, because of things that we had invested over time. So, again, U.S.-European relations, not new tensions. Burden sharing has to be addressed. It's being addressed. As we move forward, how can we make sure we continue to get that concrete work of protecting relationships and ensuring that we don't lose sight of other issues that are important? Okay. Greenland. Well, it's actually not a dissimilar problem set, right? Change in threat perceptions. And I wanted to show this map because I will tell you that when I started at the U.S. European Command, in 2022, in the fall of 2022, we weren't using this map. And we were using a different map. We were looking at a map, those of you who are familiar with World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War politics. It had the United States and Canada here, big vast ocean, Europe over here, and then a big, ugly Russia over there. That was part of every U.S. European Command map, of course. But by the time, about 2024, we were using a different map. And this is the map we were looking at. Our perspective on this region had changed, right? And so now, if you think about this, and what drives this? Well, a number of things drive this, right? Climate change. This part of the world was really not navigable, accessible, approachable, except for a few people who had some capabilities. We're one of them, but we're not by any means the sole owner of those capabilities. Now new things are happening. And obviously, changes in geopolitics. Of course, Greenland is not a new problem or newly strategically important, right? And those of you who know the history, and it's complicated, it's complex. I'm not an expert on it. But Greenland is something that the United States has recognized the importance of for a long time. In fact, the last territorial acquisition the United States made was in 1917 to acquire the Danish West Indies, now the U.S. Virgin Islands. And in that clause, because we had raised our interest, or in that treaty, there's a clause that says the United States will respect the sovereignty of Denmark over Greenland. Why? Because we were interested back then, right? Truman, after World War II, tried to acquire Greenland from Denmark. Wasn't an offer at the time. And we can talk about the politics of that and the questions and all of that. It was important to us. It played a critical role during World War II. And as we talked about earlier with Ambassador Ashe, and he reminded me, critical role in defending against U-boats, right? So trying to figure out where the Germans were coming. We based out of here. We had capabilities there. It played a potential role in deterring the Soviets during the Cold War and Soviet submarines until the Soviets developed technological capabilities that really didn't require us to be in Greenland. They could pose a threat from far further back. They didn't need to be close, and so they didn't waste their time or their energy or their resources circumnavigating here. They used the opportunity to pull their forces back home. What we noticed at U.S. European Command, however, is that even as all of this was happening in Ukraine, and Russia was expending resources and personnel and manpower and losing personnel and manpower in Ukraine and in the Black Sea, it was doubling its military, it was tripling its defense spending and production, and those resources were developing new combat units and new infrastructure in the north and in support of the Northern Fleet. Some climate predictions note that the Arctic sea lanes could open as soon as 2030. China released an Arctic strategy in 2018 that talked about a polar Silk Road. We were watching what the Chinese were doing in the Indo-Pacific and their economic capture of small island nations so that they would have positions, and we were watching their interest and discussions with the Russians who need financing for their ambitious plans in the north, and we were worried. And actually, there was a point when Greenland, again, complicated scenario, very unusual self-rule relationship with Copenhagen, wanted an airport in Nuuk, their capital. Well, people of Copenhagen, most of whom never been to Greenland, don't think about Greenland, don't want their money spent in Greenland, hadn't offered to pay for it. China came forward with a proposal. Diplomats found out about it. They went to Copenhagen and they said, not in North America, because that's North America for us, right? And the Danes said, you're right, we'll build it ourselves. And so 3 or 4 years ago, the Danes agreed to do that. Now, to be fair, small population in Greenland, right? Huge, huge budget obligation for Denmark. 3/4 of the budget that's spent in Greenland comes from Copenhagen, from the Danish taxpayers. There are, under the new agreement with that Greenland has with Denmark, competencies that the Greenlanders consume haven't assumed. So again, some very, very difficult issues. But from our perspective, all of a sudden, we got to figure out a way to get Denmark engaged in Greenland, and therefore NATO engaged in Greenland, or we have to think about other options, because we can't let this get into the hands of the Russians and the Chinese if we're going to prepare our homeland defense. Okay, that's a very simplistic discussion of an obligation, but these are the conversations that we're having. In the last few months, we have seen Denmark significantly increase the number of forces that it maintains and Greenland. We have seen NATO allies, France, Norway, the UK, others, pledge support in the form of contributions to NATO exercises in Greenland under a NATO-led operation. By the way, the United States is participating in that too. We are seeing plans for investment, and there is a high-level dialogue between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland about the way forward. Another interesting fact. The Danes and the Greenlanders have not had a strained relationship. I mean, they've had a strained relationship for years, excuse me. It wasn't until the last few months that the two of them would have ever held an international meeting together. They used to fight over who would sit in the Danish Arctic Council chair. In 2016, it was a Dane. Now, it is a Greenlander, right? So things are changing, and it's positive. And I think, from our perspective, the fact that this is happening through NATO is a really good thing. Why? Because the Greenlanders really can't afford to do the kind of investments that are necessary. And if they are independent, they will have to find somebody to help them finance it. As part of Denmark, they are part of NATO, and therefore we are able to talk to the Danes, to let them know what we're seeing, and ask the Danes to respond, right? So it's huge, huge opportunity here. It does depend on relationships. So that gets me to the point, what else should we be thinking about here? Well, it's a good thing that NATO and Denmark and other nations are investing in Greenland. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost technologies we don't have yet. Operating in that environment is very difficult. We are not necessarily the experts on it. We have some experience in Alaska, but things that plastics dissolve there, fuels freeze there. There's challenges in landing on permafrost. I'll defer to pilots and other experts on that. But, there are countries in NATO that know how to do this. The Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, all have experience. The Danes increasingly. Canada. Canada is a country we need to think about. If we're concerned about homeland defense and we're concerned about this territory, then I think we need to think about Canada a little bit, right? And whether or not we want them to be part of our conversations about the Arctic and managing this. Because at the end of the day, it is and always has been about defending the United States from its threats. Okay, a lot there. I'm sorry, I'm running on a little bit past my time limit, so let me talk about partnerships. And this is probably the part that, again, as diplomats, we invest most of our time in. Partnerships take time. They take investment. We are very good at the dime, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic tools, and bringing them all to bear in addressing a situation. And every administration has had their way of doing this, this administration included. But we can't just employ those national instruments of power just on one particular issue. We have to be thinking about what's over the horizons, what's coming next, and we have to be investing in partnerships up front so that we're prepared and that our allies and partners are prepared when we come to them with that big ask. And so we have to consider, as we work through all of these problem sets that we've talked about here today, are we investing enough? And by investing, I mean our financial resources, but I also mean our time and our rhetoric. And by the way, our communications don't necessarily cost that much. But those are things that we have to think about, because the work that I was able to do as a diplomat, that my husband was able to do as a defense attaché, was all predicated on work that predecessors had initiated. Well, some of it we initiated and completed, but it is work over time to be prepared and to be positioned when our president asks us to deliver on a policy today. And it doesn't come in the moment if you don't have that trust and that relationship over time. Okay, so I will try to wrap up a little bit here. But I think before I move on to the big issues, I think, the other question that we talk about a lot in the media is the global policeman. The fact that the United States and its citizens are maybe getting frustrated with the role that we've had to assume, have assumed, you can look at it a number of ways, as the world's global policeman. And it's a great question, and people have been predicting it and discussing it for years. But as a very wise person pointed out to me, the bigger issue, probably the harder issue, and the harder issue for the generation that is being educated and cultivated here at the Baker Institute is, who will manage the outcome of the decisions that we make today? We have relied on a set of institutions that have been dynamic, that have evolved over time, that have alternately met the moment, but also failed in certain key respects. And we are going to need actors and systems and institutions who can manage that process. And are we prepared still, as the Americans, should we try to act alone or in different partnerships and arrangements for who's going to be that next manager of the outcome? And it's been very interesting, right? Because you've seen various folks talk about, well, what if it's China that makes those rules? What if it's Russia, China, and the United States? What if it's the BRICS country? What is the formulation of China and Russia and India and Brazil and some of the other up-and-coming economies? What if it is, as the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney pointed out, a new middle powers arrangement where countries that share democratic values get together and have agency because they act themselves together? These are all great questions. I think the question for the United States is, so how do we really feel about that? How do we feel about not having that pole position, not necessarily being the one that leads and organizes those institutions and then has the say and influence that we need? Maybe we're okay with that, but maybe we're not. And so we need to think through that. Okay. I think what I really wanted to say, and I hope I've delivered on the topics I was given, but the real thing that I wanted to talk about today is what keeps me up at night. And it's not necessarily the big threats out there, although they're huge. I mean, I thought they were huge as a foreign service officer and a diplomat. And then I went to a military command, the European command, and I started talking about this and other things. And I can tell you, the threats are huge. They are far bigger than I expected. They're big, scary stuff, right? But we also have really smart people. And we have really great capabilities. And we have a great sector that can respond. And they will come up with some of these solutions to address these, what I think are tremendous problems today of cyber, of energy, of technology, of AI. We'll get there, right? And please invest in all those programs too, right? We need young leaders. They'll learn it, they'll teach us, and they'll bring the Luddites like me along. So we'll get there on that. It's not the people, it's not the people, the expertise. Processes. Well, I'm a little concerned about that. I'm a little concerned that as we seek to reform institutions, beginning with our State Department, beginning with our Department of Defense, our national government, our national security structures, let alone our partnership organizations, that in the process, we will lose some really important expertise. People who have worked issues for years have a granular feel for them, know where the arguments and the dead bodies are and the points that we can bring out. We're going to lose some of that expertise, people who've been through things. We're going to lose some of the processes that we've come to rely on to make sure that all of this information that is important is aggregated, evaluated, that consequences are weighed, that risks are mitigated, and that all of this somehow comes together in a policymaking process that then gives the folks who really have to make the hard decisions the confidence that they've had people work through this all. That's changed a little bit, and it's not clear to us what that's going to look like. But I'm also confident that we're going to figure that out, and we're going to come up with processes that continue to serve our leaders in a way, because that's what we do, and that's, I hope, largely what the school is also teaching the next generation of leaders to invest in. What worries me most is that we have entered an era where for various reasons, decisions are made quickly, in sound bites, in quickness. Media is no longer something that has the people's trust. We don't know what to believe in terms of AI. We don't know who to listen to and who to turn off. We don't have the time and the energy to get to the facts ourselves. And so we, misunderstand, misrepresent, make bad decisions, but most of all, we might give up. And we might become so frustrated that we become disinterested. So my biggest fear is that Americans, and I don't say this, it's not that we won't stay interested in geopolitics. I think we will. We're curious people. We watch the news. We care about things. But that we will stop investing, and we will stop building, and we will lose the trust that we have shared. And I will tell you that as an ambassador in North Macedonia, you're entrusted with great responsibilities. But I lived in a country that did not have a lot of trust in its government. It was a new country that was trying to build its systems. Its governments had not served them well for various reasons, for huge issues. The people didn't feel like they actually had a role or an opportunity or an access. They didn't trust what the government was telling them. They trusted the United States. And much of what we were able to do, including with the leaders of North Macedonia, by supporting them, was to help them achieve things that they had long sought in terms of their military reforms, their political reforms, their economic reforms, their anti-corruption efforts. It's that partnership, that trust in the United States. I worry about that trust going away for our diplomats, and most importantly, I worry about that trust going away. So, let me end on a positive note. The work that is being done here, the fact that we have the Ashe Lecture Forum, the fact that you very busy people would take an hour out of your extremely busy schedules to sit down and have this discussion gives me great hope. Not everybody can do that. You probably can't do that on a regular basis, and we can't expect all of our country to do that. So we have to invest in this next generation, and we have to help them figure out this big problem about how we are going to continue to have the trust in our institutions and in our leaders that they need. Because if our people don't stay engaged, if they don't write Senator Baker about their concerns on the Panama Canal Treaty, they won't be heard. They won't have agency, they won't have influence, and our leaders won't be able to act on our behalf and our best interest. So, on that happy note, the work that is happening here, the fact that this community shows up and is engaged and supports the Baker School and everything that the UT is trying to do here in East Tennessee gives me great hope and great pleasure, and I'm so delighted to be part of this. Thank you.
So at this point, I'm just going to start us off with a couple questions for Ambassador Byrnes. Get in our seats, yes, tall chairs. And then I'm going to open it to the audience because I'm sure you all have great questions. So I want to kind of combine all three of your points and think about the Trump administration's past few months of their diplomatic strategy in Europe, and say, okay, well, what maybe the U.S. doesn't need to be the global policeman anymore. Shouldn't Europe step up with this burden, not just with burden sharing, but also, helping be global policemen or our allies in Europe, in Asia, for example? So, what would you say to that?
Yes, I'm sorry. It's a joke I have with my husband, right? So, yes, that is all true. Yeah, I think many things are true at one time. The Europeans have to step up. They have to assume some responsibility. These are huge issues. We in the United States, we cannot afford to do this. And I will tell you, there is no better military in the world than the United States military. They will deliver and do whatever we ask them to do. But it is not unlimited, the resources that they have, the manpower, the equipment, the time hours. I mean, I watched families struggle with extended prepared to deploy orders, to be prepared, not just for what was happening in Europe, and especially not for what was happening in Europe, frankly, but what was happening in other parts of the globe. This takes its toll on its military, and every time we ask the military to be part of our diplomatic and informational and economic affairs and to provide that big booming, threat in the background so that hopefully all of these other things will work, it comes at a cost. And so the Europeans have to step up and they have to do more and they can do more. But we also need to understand what that will mean and that we will assume risk in the fact that they will then be able to do things by themselves. I will tell you that one of the biggest concerns we had during managing the situation in Ukraine was, okay, but what if the Russians attack Poland and attack Romania? And not that Article 5 and NATO and all, that didn't worry us. That would have its place. But what if they hit a population center in Poland and Poland said, we got to respond. You just killed our people. I mean, think, this is the conversation that we have in the headquarters. Would we stop them? If they did that, how would Russia respond? Because I can tell you, they probably wouldn't hit Poland back. They'd probably find another way to respond, or they could potentially find another way to respond. So these are really, really important, real questions that we have to think about. And I think we can manage them, but it's true. If they have the agency and they have the equipment and they have their autonomy, they may choose to do things that we may not wish them to do.
And how damaging, the media makes it seem like NATO and the EU and the US are very far apart now, and the relationships, have been damaged. So how damaging are these in the long term, would you say? Yeah,
I mean, it's a really good question, and the honest answer is I don't know. I was asked a question by one of your brilliant students earlier in Dean Wanamaker's leadership class on the side. And I have to say, I'm hopeful and I believe that we can manage the relationship with the political leaders because they understand the intent. They understand, what they need to do. They recognize that they need the United States, and I think they still want very, very much for the U.S. relationship with Europe to be strong, to provide the incredible economic and political and all the other benefits that come with that relationship. My worry, again, is that we are in a different time where public opinion doesn't necessarily wait for the space of those diplomatic negotiations to take place. And if the political leaders don't have the support of their publics, they won't be able to make those decisions. And so I worry about the public opinion in the United States, but I worry about the public opinion in Europe. So it is not without consequence, and it is important how they feel, right? It sounds soft. They feel hurt, they feel resented, they feel I got it, but these are human actors, and I think that's what you recognize in diplomatic relations. We are rational actors, and rational doesn't necessarily mean we are purely logical. It means we respond and we react, and emotion is part of that. And so, how they feel about us, it matters. And I liked being an American diplomat who walked into a room and people wanted to engage me and wanted to know what I think and wanted to work with me.
And then last question before I open it to the audience. What does this all mean for the Ukraine war? With, Europe is probably more unified than they have been in a while because of the Greenland situation and other issues. And does this mean that, Europe had already stepped up with yes. Ukraine, but what does this mean in terms of the U.S. role in Ukraine and working with NATO as a member of NATO, or all of that?
All of that. I mean, again, a big question. I don't have a complete answer. I think that it has become clear that to the Europeans, Russia actions in Ukraine pose an immediate and direct threat to the security of Europe. Russia's actions in Ukraine do not pose the same immediate and direct threat to the United States homeland. It is a difference, and I think that our European allies are now beginning to understand that. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't care about Ukraine, and it doesn't mean that we don't have interests in Ukraine. But it does mean that the Europeans have to understand that their interests and the reason they need to have good relationships and a durable peace in Ukraine are different from our reasons for a durable peace in Ukraine. So I think it's important, and I think what NATO has done, which is essentially to set up a mechanism that defines capabilities that Ukraine really needs militarily. So not things that make a good photo op for governments, but that really, really help the warfighter or the defenders of the economic grid, because it's not just about the military, right? To define those critical needs that Ukraine has. And the United States can help influence the development of that list. The Europeans then have found mechanisms where they will offer the assistance, the money, including to buy U.S. solutions to that we can then help Ukraine. And that is not an unimportant role that we are now playing for Ukraine. So I think that's important, and I do believe that a solution to Ukraine will not happen until Putin is forced to make a decision. I do not believe that anything has changed his calculus thus far. And I do not believe that we're going to have good faith negotiations until such time as he recognizes that he can't achieve what he's trying to achieve the way he's trying to achieve it. And I don't think that conversation takes place without the United States diplomatic power at the most senior levels. So I think we do still have a vital role to play.
All right, at this time, we have someone with a microphone, so please wait until, if you raise your hand, I'll call on you. If let's start back here so just wait for the microphone and it'll come to you. And then, thank you. And please be brief in your questions since we have limited time.
I'll try my best. Is it on? Yes. All right. Happy to be asking my second question today. I was actually in Dean Wanamaker's leadership class earlier, and I loved your lecture there. I loved it today as well, or right now as well. But I wanted to ask a quick question. There's been the so-called Don Roe doctrine, the sort of transition from a European defense to more of a Western Hemisphere style defense. And it was illustrated best in the National Security Report for the White House, or National Security Strategy, where the Western Hemisphere was placed before both China and Europe in the priorities of the White House. And do you think that this sort of pivot to the Americas is going to be a more of a long-lasting strategy for future administrations, or do you think it's more centered around the current one, especially with Secretary Marco Rubio, sort of having this implied emphasis that he wants to focus on the Western Hemisphere, so sort of expelling communist and sort of opposed administrations throughout the Americas?
Right. Great question. I'm going to try to resist the bait of what do I think and what's my opinion, and try to focus on, what are some of the questions that I would ask or think about as people discuss this new focus on the Western Hemisphere affairs. And I think, again, I go back to as we reallocate resources, and, when I was at European Command, we had a lot of debates about reallocating resources from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. Now we're talking about reallocating resources back into the Western Hemisphere. So again, the first question, I would ask is at what cost, right? So, obviously, it costs money. It costs money to move aircraft carriers back and forth, when you need them, to Venezuela and then to the Gulf should we need them, as we do very sensitive negotiations with Iran, right? So there's those costs. There's the cost of reorganizing commands that comes with it. I was recently at the transfer. It would have been a change of command at U.S. Forces, Army U.S. Forces Command, but it wasn't just. It was a transition to the Western Hemisphere Command for the U.S. Army, right? So all of these things now change things, and the people who support that command are going to have to move and relocate, and so there's those costs, and then there's the costs to relationships, right? If we spend our diplomatic energies in this region, what are the diplomatic problems? We'll have fewer resources to address, which isn't to say that this isn't the most important priority. You asked if it would change over time. I don't know. I think that largely depends on the threats that our leaders perceive, and then the decisions they make. And what we will try to do, well, I'm retired now, so I guess just by talking about it I will. But what I predict that people who care about national security to do in private or public roles is to make sure that the debate makes our leaders, demands that our leaders answer some of these questions. Maybe not immediately and publicly to us because there's sensitivity to this, but at least in their deliberations consider, what are we doing or what are we losing if this happens? If we're positioned, for example, here around the homeland and we have to take action in Iran, will we be able to do that? Have that question all the time about supporting our dear ally Israel and what we can do and how we can do it. If China makes a move on Taiwan, how will we be able to respond to that? Again, big questions that we all have to ask as we look at these things, which is not to say that concerns in our Western Hemisphere are not important. It's a question of how do we devote a finite number of resources to an extremely complex and challenging geopolitical problem set.
Great, thanks. I think we had one back here first, and then we'll...
Maybe just to burrow down a little bit on that, but the EU is like it's 450 million people and 340 million in the United States, in the $45 trillion GDP range combined. Russia is 2 trillion, 140 plus million people. They've had 1 million casualties already, either killed or taken out of action. This year, they're expected, according to Foreign Affairs, they're expected to spend 2/3 to all of their federal oil reserve money. They said they're not going to continue to be able to escalate their war spending. They're already spending 40% plus on prosecuting the war, plus national security. Over the last 2 years, they've had a tremendous decline in the general population's support of this war. And they can't borrow because of sanctions, so they have this unprecedented, maybe as high as 4.3% budget deficit this year that they have to finance themselves by raising taxes. They're losing 10 to 12 soldiers per one Ukrainian soldier, so that's why they're hitting the civilian population to demoralize them. They can't kill their soldiers. The United States, what I don't understand is if they supported the EU with the same intensity that the EU is feeling, they could end this war promptly. I mean, is that a fantasy?
It's a really good question. One of the things that I was struck by in some of my conversations when we talked about the Russia problem set, more at the beginning of the outset of this issue. And one of the fundamental challenges that we faced is that we can't talk about Russia as if we were fighting Russia. Because the United States would not wage war with Russia the way that Ukraine has had to defend its territory from Russian aggression. Again, they have an invested stake. It's their land. It's their people, and they've been hampered by it. But also because they don't have the capabilities, they don't have the risks. I mean, if you think about the early days of the war and how Ukraine fought, we would have taken out Russian air power like that, right? We would have taken steps that no country can take. That includes Europe. Yes, they have money and they have resources, but they do not have extended long-range capabilities that the United States does. Now, there's good reason that the United States didn't use those capabilities, and I'm not arguing that we should have. I don't think we should have, and I think, worries about the risk of escalation with Russia are real. Because again, for the United States, there's a lot more at stake here than just Ukraine or even NATO, right? When it comes to US-Russia, right? So I'm not arguing for that. I'm saying it is a different perspective. And certainly for the European Union, as you say, they have very different populations. They have some of the most complicated governing structure. And I would, as I would tell my colleagues at the US European Command, it is probably the most governed real estate on the planet, right? You have supranational organizations, you have national organizations, you have federal organizations, you have local organizations, you've got county organizations, regulations everywhere. It is really hard for them to come together and to make decisions, let alone to deploy capabilities beyond their territory. And we've learned that over a series of exercises over the years where we've tried to help them develop the ability to enable their forces, to provide the logistics supply chains, to move troops at rapid paces. And there's a lot of deep work that's happening in NATO to help them build that. And it's having great results, but it is not there yet. And money alone won't fix the problem. Economic decision won't fix the problem. Even if they could, then rally the public opinion and get the support for what they need. I mean, so there's a lot of very, very complicated issues here that go beyond political will, right? And it's hard. And there have been reports that the European Union has and Europe in general have issued that look at this, identify the problem, look at the problem, identify the problem, talk about the problem, and propose some solutions which are now beginning to take hold, but it's going to take time. So it's a really tough question. Do I think that militarily the Europeans would have what it takes to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine? I don't. And I think that would be very difficult for them to develop outside of the NATO planning capability, because what NATO does is provide the space for these countries to come together. And it provides, frankly, a safe space. I mean, Greece and Turkey together supporting Ukraine. Think about that. I mean, Greece and Turkey have had strong defense budgets for years, but it wasn't for NATO's sake, right? That's not why they invested in their militaries. And yet, those resources within NATO pooled together collectively, planning together, preparing, training, exercising, rehearsing together can bring an impact. And I would argue that at least for the near-term future, the only country that can bring those countries fully together is the United States. And that's based on trust, it's based on respect, and it's based on the fact that we have powers that all of these countries, even collectively, simply don't have.
So it sounds like the transatlantic relationship is still very important, despite the national security strategy not highlighting the European relationship. We are out of time, and I'm so sorry. I know there are other questions. I don't know if you're willing to chat with people after, but for a few minutes maybe. So I do want to thank Ambassador Byrnes. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
And as I mentioned, if you're interested, of course, speaking of Europe and Russia, the New START treaty, which was our, non-proliferation treaty with Russia expired this month. So things are even worse in terms of. So if you're interested in that topic,
that keeps me up at night.
Yeah,
too,
that's another issue. So
I'm glad you're focused
that
on it.
that will be discussed on Friday. Eric, what time is it? 2:30. Thank you. 2:30 to 3:30 here in Toyota Auditorium. Again, 207. Thank you. Sorry. Not in here, room 207. There's a flyer outside. If you are not on our mailing list, please take a flyer and send us an email. Either way, come up to me or any of us, and we'll get you signed up. Thank you so much, and have a lovely evening.